best entertainment on the earth. Tune in for Comics with Perch.
Hey everybody, this is Perch. One of the cool things that I think exists that doesn't get touched on a lot, I've done a couple of videos on it, but it's the similarities in some cases between two pop culture icons, comic books and professional wrestling. And so this person writes in with a comparison that I do think works, I think is accurate. So let's get into that because it's an interesting one. For those of you who are wrestling fans, you'll be into this. For those of you who are not, it's going to be 10 minutes of boredom, or as Mumbles would say, an average video. So this one goes, "Hey Perch, I seek your insight as a fellow lover of comics and wrestling. Is Jack Kirby the Bret Hart of comics?" Okay, I'm on board with this analogy. I think this could be good. Some people I've heard before, people say that Jack Kirby was the Stan Hansen of comics, which I think Stan Hansen was a brawler. I've heard people compare Jack Kirby to Kobashi or Misawa from All Japan. I think there's technical aptitude, but I think in terms of kind of the flair and the excitement and kind of the different elements going on, I don't know. Those don't fit. Bret Hart is an interesting one. Master of technical and some showmanship. Interesting comparison. Let's get into it. One great thing about YouTube, this is the letter now continuing, is that you can find great videos about the history of comics and their creators that you wouldn't expect to see much of on TV or even streaming services. Yeah, for sure. I love learning about Jack Kirby, but it always breaks my heart a little bit when I see how he was treated by Marvel and DC and passed away before he was more properly recognized for his contributions to comics. It's especially jarring when you see how quick DC was to get rid of him. Meanwhile, it's hard to imagine DC today without Darkseid or the New Gods or a lot of that stuff. Yeah, for sure. Bret Hart was obviously one of the all-time best wrestlers, but still a bit overlooked in his time, often falling to backstage politics because he just wanted to wrestle. In fairness, Bret Hart also played some politics. He was not as adept at them and skilled as like a Shawn Michaels was or a Hogan was. Bret Hart did have the reputation of wanting to wrestle. He had the Hart family, he had the dungeon, and he had the kind of this legacy, which was always going to set him apart a little bit from Vince. Vince liked characters that were or wrestlers, people with a legacy, but only when he could control that legacy. And there's a lot of the Hart family that went outside Vince's domain. Anyway, sorry. Bret then got fed up with how WWE was treating him and went to WCW, which should have been a huge deal, but history has shown that it was never meant to be, and Bret hated his short time there. Yeah, and was ultimately retired out of it. It has only been after Bret's career that later generations of wrestlers and fans really began to appreciate what he gave us. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but I can say I'd love to see your insight about these two legends and how they compare. I think there's a lot of similarities. I think that Bret Hart was certainly appreciated during his time, but his window was short. The challenge with Bret Hart was he was a victim of timing as much as almost anything else. Bret Hart's moment in wrestling was to kind of pick up the baton from Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, some of the people who had been WWE mainstays. He'd paid his dues to get to that point. And just as he was about to get there, Shawn Michaels was coming up, who was seen as a rival, and Michaels was kind of notoriously, I said Michaels was an adept player of politics. But the other thing that happened, I think, that was a little bit unforeseen is, when Hogan and Savage and ultimately Kevin Nash, Scott Hall jumped over to WCW, it ushered in the Attitude Era, which was an era that was probably, worst for Bret. He was just not a character of that time. If Bret Hart had, emerged 5 years earlier, I think he would have, run the show at WWE if he had been stronger, or if he'd come, 5 to 10 years after. The challenge was in an era that was going to usher in Steve Austin, and it should be noted that Bret Hart's match with Steve Austin was really what, got Steve Austin over. I think that that moment was Bret Hart giving the WWE a superstar, and I think there should be a lot of credit attributed to Bret for that. Now Austin did his own work, and he was obviously very charismatic on the mic, and he was a beneficiary to the time, as was The Rock, Mick Foley, who got a second life through that era, the Attitude Era. But Hunter Hearst Helmsley, certainly Triple H, also. But Bret Hart is just wrong moment, very skilled worker, wrong moment, wrong time, and that mirrors comics to some extent. Jack Kirby, was a workhorse, I think, but his contribution to Marvel in the '60s was massive, and it was recognized. It was just that Stan Lee was getting as much of a credit. I think that it's less that. It's less that Stan Lee was stealing Jack's credit, although Stan Lee was a natural showman, and Jack Kirby, was a lot less fond of that. So, people who embrace and lean into the marketing aspect of things are going to come out better. And Stan Lee did. He was seen as the father and then later the grandfather of Marvel Comics. He was the common thread. Jack Kirby was the artist visionary, but he didn't really want to have the same kind of spotlight on him that Stan Lee did. He accepted it, and I think later in life and in his career, he came to embrace it to some extent. Well, no, embrace it is wrong. He came to accept it. He understood that it was necessary, but Jack Kirby was never a natural at that. In many cases, I think that's where the comparison to Bret Hart is pretty apt. In that, Bret Hart did the heel turn through the Steve Austin bit, and then he tried to do the Canada's taking over, but it always felt slightly unnatural coming out of Bret. When you watch Bret Hart, you wanted to watch somebody who was going to tear it up in the ring and do put on a real class on wrestling, somebody who had enough charisma to be exciting when he came out, the theme music and the look and giving sunglasses to the kids and everything else. He was into it, but his heart was in the ring, and it showed. And Jack Kirby, he came to understand that, being promoted as Kirby, with the whole Kirby is coming and then kind of the slight rebirth of Marvel, he understood he needed to participate in that marketing. But again, what he wanted to do was leave his art on the page. That's where his specialty was, and he embraced that. So I think you have two individuals who just didn't quite align to the time. But I think Jack Kirby got a better run of it. I think Jack Kirby, certainly after death, it's continued to live on, although I would argue DC still hasn't paid him anywhere close to the dues that Kirby deserves for what he contributed to DC. But in Marvel, I think there is that, he was seen as kind of the father of that era, and he did have a big legend attached to him. And I think there wasn't, even though Stan Lee was taking the credit, I don't think Stan Lee was taking the talent. And in many cases in wrestling, I think Bret got caught up in, when it was meant to be his moment. Shawn Michaels got a reputation for being a great ring worker, which he was. And you had Austin, who was, I think Austin's a very charismatic performer, but Austin was definitely a more limited worker. So was The Rock. They did moves, but that was the era where, Flash thoroughly exceeded work rate. It's why you have, even Roman Reigns, who, they finally positioned him as a heel and everything else, but, that's not a strong worker in the ring. Brock Lesnar is not the strongest worker in the ring. You have somebody like Cesaro, who is, or even, characters like Seth Rollins, who I think are far, far better workers in the ring. But the place in wrestling right now is for showmanship. Even CM Punk, who has a lot of attention. As far as a worker, he's not, in my book, he's not at a Dean Malenko or Chris Jericho level. But anyway, so it's an interesting comparison. I think that Jack Kirby, I think, deserves more praise from DC, and I think Kirby is getting it at Marvel. The shame of it was that Disney is happily calling, Jack Kirby one of the architects of the company, which is nice respect for him. But this all comes after thoroughly ignoring him for a long period of time. And you have to wonder, how much of that, Disney flinched when the allegations, some allegations came out that, maybe Stan Lee was, just the kind of the dirt that went on around him. And it seemed like they pivoted to Kirby in that moment as a way to kind of distance themselves from Lee. So I always looked at it as not like they were truly understanding the gift that Kirby gave to comics and gave to Marvel, but more like, it's like, well, here's somebody with less controversy than Stan Lee, and he punches Nazis. So it always has left a bit of a bad taste in my mouth, kind of how that has come, kind of like I think you're describing in this mail. But I think that's probably if you're going to compare Kirby to a wrestler, Bret Hart is probably a damn good one to do that with. I think he is. That is, there you go. That's who he is. Now I got to figure like who's the Greg Land of wrestling. Like who's a wrestler just copies of the wrestler's moves? I don't know. Anyway, is Warren Ellis the Val Venus of wrestling? uh, yeah. Anyway, thanks for listening.